Welcome to the Power of Purity podcast, the show that empowers men to experience their sexual gift in a healthier way. Now here's your host, Tony Ingracia.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Power of Purity podcast, and thank you so much for being with me today. And I pray that as we begin today's episode that you're in a place where you're just walking with God and seeking God and chasing after God and experiencing the shadow of God over your life, and that you feel blessed as you continue to pursue your own good heart and your walk of purity. So God bless you for being here today, and I do pray that today's episode is going to be a blessing to you. And let me say that I have no doubt that it's going to be, because I have a very, very special guest, and I can't tell you guys how excited I am about this guest and how I've been looking forward to this conversation, because our guest today is a gentleman named Jay Stringer, and Jay is a therapist and a minister and a researcher, and he's got a lot of really good, awesome information that he's going to share with us. So let me just start by saying hi, Jay.
Hello, Tony. Thank you for having me on your podcast.
Thank you so much for your willingness to share with us and to give us this time. So I just deeply appreciate it. And as I said, I'm really excited about the opportunity to meet you and to talk to you and to hear the things that you have to share with us. So thank you so much.
Indeed.
I'm wondering, Jay, if we could start, can you tell us just a little bit about yourself? I have no doubt that many of our listeners probably have heard of you and maybe even be familiar with who you are and what you do and your work, but just a little bit about yourself. Where do you live? Are you married? Do you have kids? Do you love to go hiking or fishing? Or just a little bit about who is Jay Stringer?
Sure. So I live in Seattle, Washington with my wife, Heather. And we actually met in grad school, both studying counseling psychology. So this summer, we will have our 10-year anniversary. And we have two kids, a 6-year-old boy and a 4-year-old girl. And we are actually going back to Costa Rica, which is where we went for our honeymoon. And in my calendar, I just put surfing for about 10 days, 12 days.
Wow, how fun for you.
I love to surf. Don't surf nearly as much as I want to, but I love the outdoors. Seattle definitely has some of the most beautiful parts in the country that I have ever been. So if you can kind of get a pretty sunny, nice day, there are just stunning hikes and outdoor experiences within about an hour of Seattle. So
wonderful. So how soon do you go to Costa Rica?
This will be in August.
Okay.
Is our 10-year anniversary.
Well, congratulations, and I'm sure it'll be here before you know. And by the way, I'm a little bit familiar with what you're saying about the Seattle area, because I have been there. I was invited, it's been several years ago, by a church in the area to do a purity conference that I do there. And it was a beautiful experience, and it was the fall, and it was an absolutely stunning area and very beautiful and scenic. And I can see what you're saying about Seattle.
Yes. I mean, just even last weekend, I was wearing my winter jacket, and then I had my rain jacket on the next day, and then it was about 80 degrees, and my kids and my family and I were at the beach, so I was in a bathing suit. From winter jacket to bathing suit weather is what you can expect in Seattle from time to time, especially as it approaches the summertime. So
that's amazing. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, your tagline, and by the way, let me just say this right up front, that your website is Jay Stringer, STRINGER.com. That's J-Stringer.com. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So I just want to say to our listeners that you might want to check out Jay's website after you hear him on today's episode and next week's episode, because I have no doubt that you're going to want to look at his website and kind of check out some of his resources. So I just want to mention that right up front. But anyway, it says that you're a therapist and you're a minister and you're a researcher. So can you tell us just a little bit about that? I'm curious, are you actually a pastor? Are you pastoring a church?
I'm not currently pastoring a church. No, I am ordained as a Christian Reformed minister, helped plant a church in the Seattle area. Not currently pastoring. There was a point a couple of years ago when I started this project for, the title of my book is Unwanted, How Sexual Brokenness Reveals Our... And when I started that book project, I was doing my taxes and had about 11 or 12 1099s from organizations that I was doing work with, including my own church, and just realized that I needed to kind of take a couple steps back from partnering, collaborating with other organizations just to focus on some of my own research. So that's still ordained and still have a private practice, but not currently pastoring.
Okay, wonderful. And the name of this podcast is the Power of Purity podcast. So we talk issues, but very much an emphasis on the topic of sexuality and topics around issues that people struggle with around their sexuality and sexual addiction and sexual issues. And that's the primary theme. And it's very obvious that that's kind of the area that you also focus on from your book, from your research, from your website. So can I ask kind of how did you find your way into this area of expertise and this interest for you to help people around issues of brokenness around sexuality?
We know as a society that men who buy sex is just an overwhelming prevalent issue in our world today. So we know that about 57% of our pastors have looked at porn. 64% of our youth pastors. We know that about, at least 2/3 of church-going men, about 1/3 of all pornography users are now women. So we know the stats. But
wow, it's overwhelming.
Overwhelming. And so even though most research is focused on basically how bad of an issue is this in our world today, I wanted to go a little bit deeper into what is the why that's actually driving this to begin with. So then as a therapist, I started having a lot of men and women showing up to my office that I would say predominantly fell under these lust management approaches. So they had, tried to bounce their eyes from people that they found attractive. They had tried to install internet monitoring on their computers. They had tried accountability, and yet what most of them found was that these were not actually providing pathways to freedom. So one of my clients said to me recently, he said, Jay, when I've been having the same conversation with my accountability partner for 15 years, something isn't quite working. And so what I realized is that unless we radically change this conversation, we are going to continue to consign individuals to a lifetime of futility with this issue. So, as a pastor, as a minister, as a therapist, one of the ideas that has just impacted me so deeply is that when you see God's engagement with people, especially throughout the Old Testament, God is exceedingly curious. And so when God shows up to Adam, he doesn't say, bounce your eyes from that next tempting piece of fruit. He says, where are you? Or to Jacob, who's struggling with this issue of identity, the angel of the Lord says, basically, what is your name? And then to Hagar, who has just been immensely traumatized by the first family of our faith, the angel of the Lord appears to her and I think asks two of the best questions that any of us could ever be.
Let me guess.
Yeah.
Where have you come from and where are you going?
Indeed. Yes. So beautiful. And so to me, that's the way that I think God engages us. God, the face of the Father is not turned towards us, waiting for us to become pure, waiting for us to get our acts together. I think God arrives in our story to ask us questions, to say, where have you come from? And where is it that you want to go with this one wild, beautiful gift that you've given? So that's what I wanted to research is, how does our story, past and present, go on to shape our sexual brokenness? Because, and that's what I wanted to seek out in the research, is if I could just ask people to tell us their whole story, not just the story of their sexual brokenness, I figured we could get a lot of data and insights that we could then return back to people that were struggling. And that's exactly what I found. And the thesis of my work is this, is that unwanted sexual behavior, the use of porn, infidelity, buying sex, is actually not random at all. It is a direct reflection of the parts of our story that remain. And so that if we want to find freedom from porn, infidelity, any of our sexual brokenness, we need to identify the unique reasons that bring us to it in the first place. And I think that this is huge. It means that our sexual brokenness can actually become our greatest teacher instead of just a life sentence to sexual shame.
Wow. That is so powerful and so intriguing and so beautiful. And I have my copy of your book right here, and I highly recommend to our listeners that you check out Jay's book, Unwanted. And again, the subtitle is How Sexual Brokenness Reveals Our Way to Healing. And I just got the book recently in view of our interview, and I haven't got to read the whole book yet. I'm going to read it, but I'm over halfway through. And one of the things that I loved about the book so far is this very obvious emphasis in your writing around the concept of story and understanding our story, and kind of introducing or inviting God into our story, understanding how our story has affected us and shaped us and led us to the place where we currently are struggling. So can you just put maybe a few more words to this concept of story? Why is story so important? I might ask it this way. It feels like to me that a lot of people, their intuition would be, if I'm struggling with something in my life, like my intuition is to move away from it, to run away from it. I want to get away from it because I've been struggling with it. And it almost feels, Jay, like you're saying to do the very opposite thing. Don't try to get away from your story. Rather, turn around and face your story and move into your story.
So, Tony, yes, I am raising my fist in delight. That's exactly what we're invited to do. And I think most of us realize that at some point we are going to have to turn and face the pain, face the issues in our life that are driving us to our unwanted behavior to begin with. So one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about recently is a conversation that I actually had with my grandmother, I would say about 2 years before she passed away. I was in grad school at the time, learning a lot about our story, learning about how basically our family system, our family history shapes who we become, and realized that I knew almost nothing about any of my grandparents. I was named after my grandfather, Jay. Jay died 2 years before I was born, so that's where I get my name from. And then my mom's dad's name is Elmer, and he died when I was in grad school. And so one of the sad things at his funeral was that I just felt like I never really knew my grandfathers. So realized if I wanted to know anything about my grandmothers, this would be the time to do it. So I took my grandmother out to a cafe on her 90th birthday, and before I took her out to lunch, I went to an antique store to get 3 skeleton keys. And I wanted to, get these 3 skeleton keys from the era of her birth year, and I gave them to her, and I said, "Grandma, these 3 keys symbolize 3 lunches that I want to take you out to learn more about the Stringer family name." And I thought she would love the gift, but she looked completely dismayed, completely horrified.
Wow.
And, 5 seconds passed. She eventually looked down at the keys, looked back up at me, and then pushed the keys back across the table and said, "Jay, there are some doors you just don't open. There are some stories you just don't tell."
Wow.
And in that instance, I was like, wow, my family life makes so much sense to me. So when we think about why do we hide our brokenness? Why are we bonded to pornography? Why is it a particular, pornography search continues to appeal to us year after year after year? A lot of those stories are actually very encoded into our family of origin and kind of the family history that we received. And so that was part of the grappling that I really needed to do with my own story is my family history sets me up really well to conceal, to hide brokenness, and to not reveal it, not to bring it into the light. And so I think that that's what we have to kind of say is in your family of origin, did your mom, did your dad talk to you about the goodness and beauty of sex, or did they not say a word about it? When you watched, pornography for the first time, did you just randomly discover it in a field? Or more than likely, what all the research indicates is that someone introduced that to you. That could be a peer in the neighborhood, someone older than you. And so when we really begin to step into what is our story, but even the story of when we began to lean on unwanted behavior or when porn or things like sexual abuse began to enter in, that is all of our story as it relates to our sexuality. And so a lot of times what happens for us as adults is that the only thing that we can see when we are in the ruts of shame is our unwanted behavior. And so part of what my work is trying to do is to kind of invite people to go back to what is the story that you come from? Because if we're going to heal, we begin to address some of the pain in our past and some of the present obstacles that we don't know how to get through without outsourcing them to our unwanted behaviors.
Wow. I'm reading from the introduction of your book. I have 3 sentences here highlighted on what would be page XX of the introduction, and it says, "Our sexual brokenness is the geography of God's arrival." I love that. And then it says, "Therefore, the sooner we assume a posture of curiosity for our sexual brokenness, the more we will prepare our hearts for the redemptive work ahead. The paradox of the gospel is that our failures do not condemn us, but rather they connect us." That's very beautiful. So this line that our sexual brokenness is the geography of God's arrival, how would you put words to that?
Yeah, it's such a sweet gift to have those words be read back to me. So thank you for doing that. I think that this is part of what I would just say is biblical theology, that God tabernacles in place of weakness, up in Adam's brokenness. God shows up in Jacob's identity struggle. God shows up in the trauma of Hagar. And then when we move into the New Testament, part of what we see Jesus taking on is he takes on what's called the sarx of humanity. So in the New Testament, there are 2 words for the body, soma and sarx. And soma is usually a reference to the body and its wholeness and its delight and its power. And then sarx is often in reference to the kind of disease orientation of the body. So this is a body that could be hurt, that could be damaged. And so what John tells us is that God actually, in the form of Jesus, comes in and becomes, he takes on our sarx. And so to me, that is just such a beautiful imagery of when God is going to come into our story, it's going to be in the place of our brokenness.
Wow.
And so oftentimes we try and get it all together so that God will come find us, or that we'll actually be able to have the flourishing life that we've been promised. But I think the reality is that God's delight is actually to move into these places of shame, these strongholds where evil has convinced us that we will never experience freedom, that shame is going to be what we will face day in and day out. And so I think part of what we have to learn is that God is not ashamed of our brokenness. He's not surprised by it. But far more, he considers our sexual brokenness to be the very stage through which the work of redemption is going to be played out in our lives.
Wow. And therefore, our sexual brokenness becomes the very geography of God's arrival.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe said another way, that's the very place where God wants to meet us. And
Yes.
isn't it interesting, Jay, just listening to you there makes me think, I don't know why, but I'm just thinking this idea of the incarnation. You know, Christianity
Mm-hmm.
is incarnational. It's God becoming flesh. It's God moving toward us, right? He took on flesh.
Yes.
He sent his son. It's God, in other words, entering the cesspool. God coming into our mess. It's not God staying way over there and saying, you come out of the mess to me, and then I'll meet you and work deeply and powerfully in your heart and life. But I will come to you in the mess.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, I'll come to you in your sexual brokenness. I'll meet you there, and we can begin there. And that becomes the geography for the redemptive work that God has intended for us.
Yeah, I had a friend recently tell me, he said, Jay, religion is basically when you make a mistake and you say, oh crap, God is going to kill me. But basically sonship, the gospel is, oh crap, I made a mistake. I really need to call my dad. And so I love that juxtaposition of when we feel like we are failing, when we feel like we've made some mistakes, that we're covered in shame. Part of what we need to understand is that the face of God is turned towards us with kindness. And his heart, his very mission is to bring wholeness, integration, and love to our lives. So it's such a healing and always disruptive anticipation of saying, no, God is actually kind and moves into the places that I would prefer that he not know about and not enter.
Wow. That's totally awesome, because if it's really true, and I believe that it is, then God becomes a person that I want to run toward instead of running away from.
Yes.
And I just love this concept of story. I just wanted to mention, and I think most of my listeners already know this, but I've written a couple books that I self-published, and I kind of wrote a testimony of my own life and the sexual journey of my life, from brokenness to redemption, from addiction to freedom. And the name of my book is Stories.
Huh.
And the reason I named the book Stories is because I'm so attracted to this concept of story, and it's so central to my template of ministry, my understanding of who God is and how God works, and the way I approach my own ministry, and the way, the primary template that I use as a professional therapist in my work with people. So what I did in this book, Jay, is it's a sequence. There's 40 chapters in the book, and the chapters are pretty short. There's a lot of them, but I did that for a reason, because they told me that men don't read well, and men prefer short little snippets, you know. So I tried to write short chapters, but it's literally not me teaching or preaching or teaching principles. I'm not trying to do that. What it is it's a sequence of 40 stories from my own life. And as you follow this trail of stories, a picture emerges, and you understand how I became such a broken man and such a wounded man as you see my stories. But then as the stories of redemption begin to emerge, God enters my life, or said another way, God enters the geography of my sexual brokenness. And now new stories are emerging. You see the pathway of redemption. So the truth is in our stories. Our stories are where we find God. Our stories are where we meet God. Our stories are where God will work with us.
Amen.
And that's what I was trying to accomplish in that book. But anyway, we're not here to talk about my book. We're here to talk about your book. So I want to ask you a couple questions and wondering if you could tell us just a little bit more about your book.
Sure.
The title is Unwanted. Again, the subtitle is How Sexual Brokenness Reveals Our Way to Healing. And I'm very intrigued about the way that you set the book up, because I noticed that there's 3 parts to the book, and each part is titled by a question. Part 1 is How I Got Here. Presumably, how did I get in my mess? How did I get in my sexual brokenness? Part 2 is Why do I stay? And part 3 is How do I get out of here? So I was wondering if you could share with us, give us like a little book review.
Sure.
And whet everybody's appetite so they want to rush out and get your book, Unwanted. Can you just put some words to each of these parts? Part 1, part 2, part 3. How I got here, why do I stay, and how do I get out of here?
Yeah. So part 1, that question of basically how did I get here, is the question that asks us to go back to some of the formative experiences in our childhood, in our relationships with our moms and dads, our introduction to pornography, maybe some of the past traumas of sexual abuse, emotional abuse that we have been through. So we're really going back to say, what's the context here? And one example that I often talk about with regard to how did I get here is, if I know a lot of people are familiar in years past with the Somali pirates that have kind of terrorized coasts off the Somalia coast for a while. One of the things that really intrigued me was basically, how did these people become pirates? And when you start studying what's happening in Somalia historically, is that you see that the internal land, the internal world of Somalia has been ruled by a lot of division, a lot of warlords, a lot of violence. And we also know that off the coasts of Somalia, the world dumps a lot of toxic waste on their shores. And then the United Nations estimates that we steal about $300 million worth of seafood off of their coasts. And so if you're going back to try and understand, why do people do these, these piracy, this pirate behavior, you have to go back to what are their origins. And so they have a lot of violence inside the country and a lot of theft on their coasts. And so you have a boat, because most Somalian men tend to be fishermen on the coast. And so that's part of the question that you have to ask is, where do you think you're going to go if you have boats, but you have nowhere to fish, and the internal geography of the land is completely unsustainable for economic development? You're going to become a pirate.
Wow.
And so that's part of what I'm inviting people in to consider is, some of the research that Patrick Carnes did was that 87% of people struggling with sexual addiction, compulsivity, come from families that were very disengaged emotionally. And 77% come from families that were very rigid or authoritarian. And we can kind of go into that in greater detail in a few minutes. But all of that to say, our sexual brokenness isn't random. The family system that we were a part of incredibly shaped our involvement with unwanted sexual behaviors and the way that we made our life work. So part 1 is to kind of go back to the original pain. But then part 2 is really this question of why is it that you stay? And this is a question that we all need to ask ourselves, because it's really easy to kind of understand why we would want to get out of our sexual brokenness. But until we realize how our sexual brokenness serves us, there really isn't going to be the motivation to find freedom. And what I mean by that is that a lot of us have to think about this in terms of, if we were on a business trip, how would we go to sleep without pornography or hooking up with someone in a hotel? If we are in a fight with our spouse around the issue of intimacy, and maybe our spouse declines that bid, we're going to experience a lot of anger and a lot of just kind of entitlement. And so if we don't know another way to engage our spouse generatively and with emotional attunement, we are going to bring that anger and that entitlement into the world of pornography 30 minutes later, an hour later. So that's one of the common stories I hear as a private practice clinician is, they make a bid, their wife declines, and then a half hour later, they're down in the basement in a bathroom looking at porn. And so that's where those strategies of, you can try and get internet filtering, you can try and phone a friend, but at some point you are really going to have to confront how you don't know how to work through a trigger without going to some form of sexual brokenness. So part 2 is really a question of how do you mature as a man or a woman? And then part 3 is really the question that we're all here to answer, which is how do I get out of here? But what I say in the book is that until you've really journeyed through those first 2 questions, part 3 is just going to feel pretty empty because it's going to, again, fill you with strategies and techniques that really aren't helpful if the origins of your pain are not addressed. And so part 3 is really this call to learning how to do things like self-care, how to have healthy relationships, and then what the role of community is in the healing journey. So wanted to create a pretty comprehensive book that addresses our whole life story and why it is that we are drawn to our unwanted behaviors to begin with.
Hey guys, with that being said, I hate to do it, but I see from the clock that we're out of time for today's episode, so I need to jump in here and interrupt. But I invite you to come back next week as we continue this interview with Jay Stringer, and I know that it will continue to be a blessing to you. I'll look forward to seeing you guys right back here at the Power of Purity podcast next week. In the meantime, be blessed. Have an awesome week. Have an awesome day. And go with God in Jesus' name. I'll see you then. Bye-bye now.
Thanks for listening. Visit powerofpurity.org for more resources and information. And if this podcast has been helpful or encouraging, please invite a friend to listen. Until next time, remember, there's power in purity.